I'm going to teach you the secret to making a butt weld completely disappear, much like this one, and it's not as difficult as you may think it is. In fact, this is something I wish I had learned much earlier on in my career. The first and arguably most important step is to make sure your panel gap is consistent and tight, much like this one. What I like to do then is put tacks about every ½ inch across the entire welded seam. It's important that the panel is completely flush everywhere I put these tacks. These will help lock in the panel and ensure that it doesn't walk around too much on you when you're welding. I find the MIG welder to be easier for this step because it's a little bit quicker and I have an extra hand to put pressure in the panel as needed, but you do you. As you can see here, I have tacks about every ½ inch or less depending on different radiuses or how tight it is, but again, it's whatever works best for you in your own process, but this is what works for me. After that's done, I grind the tops of just the welds and then hammer and dolly them to stretch them back so the gap is again consistent. Every tack that you make shrinks and pulls the panel gap tighter. Then I TIG weld the entire weld. This is important because a TIG weld is softer and stronger than a MIG weld and is much easier to planish afterwards. Be sure to protect any electronics on a vehicle before you TIG weld on it. I try to do the weld in one solid bead, but if I can't and I have to stop and start, what do is you start your puddle, walk it backwards a little bit so you can get the heat again exactly how it was before, and then continue forward. This is important because then it makes the warp afterwards much more manageable. When a panel warps, it's because the weld cools and then it shrinks. So if you can get that heat to shrink consistently across the panel instead of different increments throughout the panel, it makes it much easier to stretch out afterwards. Because then you can hammer and dial in a consistent form and not have to jump around too much. When you're done welding, you can look at your bead that you laid and you can see the heat marks in the metal, and if it's a consistent line with a consistent gap on either side of the bead to cross it, then you know the shrink is pretty much uniform. After that's done, you do what's called planishing the weld, which basically means you take a hammer and dolly and you beat the crap out of it to stretch it back. I personally try to use a dolly that has the same radius as what I'm hammering on, if not a slightly sharper radius. That's my personal preference, but you may find that something else works better for you. Make sure that you're hitting just the bead itself and you want to stretch it until there's no peaks or valleys where the bead lies. It should naturally conform to the original shape of the panel, and if it doesn't, that means you probably need to stretch more. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. Once you're done with that, go ahead and grind the welds flush and then hammer and dolly any low spots or high spots that you need to deal with afterwards. And there you have it. That's how you make your weld mostly invisible. It's a tough process, it's not easy, and it takes a lot of practice, but eventually, if you keep doing it over and over and over again, you'll get it like I did. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to drop a follow.